The first house went up on a night when the river lay black and glassy under a hood of clouds. Riverside Estate slept as it always did, the big house dozing above the fields like some brick-walled animal, windows gone dark, chimneys breathing out the last thin ghosts of supper smoke. Crickets sang in the weeds that pushed up along the carriage road. Somewhere in the quarters, a baby cried once and was shushed. To anyone looking from the water, the plantation would have seemed peaceful, ordinary, fixed in its place as firmly as the stars when they were visible. Only one person moved through that stillness with purpose. She came down the back stairs from the second floor, bare feet finding each step without a sound. For months she had learned the particular language of this house, the boards that complained under weight, the doors whose hinges would give her away if opened too quickly, the way the draft curled through the hallway when the back door was cracked just so she had become part of its breath. That night she moved as if the house itself had decided to betray the man who owned it. In the study she paused. The room smelled of tobacco and ink. Ledger books lay open on the desk, where Harold Sutherland, planter, widower, debtor, had drunk himself to a soft, snoring collapse an hour earlier. Lamplight still quivered over the neat columns of figures she had copied with her careful hand. Her work, his ruin. The numbers told his story in an unbroken fall. Soil gone poor, tobacco prices sinking, debts rising like floodwater. She set the oil lamp on the floor. Her pulse was steady. She had thought it might not be, that it might thunder in her ears when the moment finally came. Instead, a cool clarity spread through her, the same coolness she had felt years earlier on the auction block when she realized that being wanted could be turned into a weapon. She tipped the lamp. Oil breathed out in a slow, shimmering spill across the rug, darkening the threads. She guided it with the lamp's base, pushing the slick curve of flame toward the desk, the curtains, the trail she had already mapped in her mind. When she was satisfied, she set the lamp on its side and backed away. The flame hesitated, tested the air, then bent downward like a hungry animal catching scent. It licked the oil, brightened, thickened. The rug blackened, the fire walking there now, following the path she had drawn. In a minute the curtains were burning, a low crackle filled the study. Heat pressed outward and upward, carrying sparks to the shelves where documents rested. Deeds, bills of sale, letters from Richmond bankers that had turned Sutherland's hands into fists when he thought she wasn't looking. She left him his documents for company. By the time she reached the second floor, smoke had begun to creep along the ceiling. Sutherland snored behind his door. Earlier that night she had poured the wine, refilled his glass, listened to him speak of lightning and accidents, and the chance to outwit those vultures in Philadelphia. He had believed himself the architect of the plan, the man clever enough to cheat his creditors and keep his world intact. She had nodded, eyes lowered, feeling the edges of a different design fitting together in her mind. In his bedchamber, she went first to the lamp on the bedside table and turned the wick higher. Light spilled over his face, heavy, flushed, slack with drink. For a moment, she simply looked at him. There had been others before him, men who thought a girl with skin like hers, not too dark, not quite white, existed for their comfort, their curiosities, their appetites. Men who called what they did affection or privilege or nothing at all. In the dark, they asked no questions about where she had learned to read, who had given her the letters that now let her decipher their ledgers and letters. They never imagined that knowledge had come from someone who whispered, long ago, that numbers could be turned into maps, and maps into escape. She uncapped the oil flask and poured a slow circle on the floor around his bed. The smell rose sharp, thick. She moved carefully so the boards would not creak, connecting the circle to the door, to the drapes, to the trunk where his winter clothes lay folded. When she stepped back, the ring glistened faintly in the lamplight like a drawn line. "Master," she whispered, because the house expected that word from her, even now. He stirred vaguely. His eyes never opened. She touched the lamp's flame to the brightest line of oil and watched it catch. It spread faster this time, finding the trail with greedy intelligence. For a moment, flame and oil and air negotiated silently. Then the fire leapt, blooming into something that no human hand could call back. Orange light flung the bedpost's shadows high against the wall. Sutherland coughed once, twice, still half asleep, his mind unable to believe that his own plan had turned against him, that the fire would not wait until he could stand outside and watch with insurance papers in his pocket. She slipped out by the servant's stair, already rehearsing her screams. When she burst into the yard, voice ragged with feigned panic, the first-floor windows glowed as if the house had swallowed the sun. Other enslaved people stumbled into the open, eyes wide, faces silvered by moonlight and fire. Some ran toward the main doors, only to be driven back by heat that seared the hair on their arms. The overseer swore, called for buckets, for the pump, for order, as if order had ever belonged to him. No one got near the master's room. By morning, Riverside's brick walls stood empty. Like the hull of a burned ship, Sutherland's body was a charred knot in the ruins of his bed. The insurance men, pale and sweating in their dark coats, listened politely to the account of a lamp overturned in the study and a drunken master too far gone to escape. They asked questions. They pretended to doubt. In the end, they signed their names, passed money to creditors and distant relations, and rode away, glad to leave the stink of ash and ruin behind. The woman called Clara in the plantation ledger was already gone. In Richmond, she was someone else, a young, free woman of color, with forged papers folded carefully in her bodice and a small roll of stolen bills tied to her thigh. On Gray Street, carriages rattled past the townhouses that human flesh had built. Auction bells clanged near Shockoe Bottom, drawing planters into brick buildings where they could prod and price and measure. She moved through those streets unnoticed, one more dark face among many. She had killed her first master. The knowledge sat in her chest, not as triumph, not as fear, but as a new fact about the world. Something could be done. The second man died months later in Albemarle County, and she was not there to see the flames. When she first saw Marcus Dalton's house, white columns rising against the hills near Charlottesville, the place looked almost gentle compared to riverside wheat fields rolled away in soft waves. Trees lined the lane. The university's distant domes and red roofs glimmered on the horizon. Dalton liked to think of himself as a gentleman of ideas, not just a man of crops. His library overflowed with volumes on philosophy, law, and agriculture. He hired her as Sarah because that was the name on the paper she handed him. She could see him weighing the page in his mind more than the woman standing before him. This documented creature, this almost safe anomaly in a world where black skin usually meant property. "You can read?" he asked on the second day, surprised when he found her tracing the words of a letter with her finger. "A little," she said. "My mother worked in a house, sir. Sometimes the missus would have us read scripture after supper." It was a lie polished thin by repetition, but men like Dalton preferred their lies familiar. He liked to talk in the evenings, glass in hand, words spilling faster as the level in the decanter fell. He spoke of liberty and natural rights, of the troubling contradiction between the ideals written in the Declaration and the reality beneath his feet. Sometimes he stopped, fingers tightening around the glass, and said, "Ah, but what would you know of such things?" Then he would laugh uncomfortably and ask for more wine. She poured, she listened, she watched. He was weaker than Sutherland in ways that mattered. Guilt gnawed at him. His debts did too. Wheat prices had fallen, and his fine thoughts did not pay the men in town who held notes against his land. She learned the size of those debts when he asked her to help straighten his accounts. She had a neat hand. She copied the figures into fresh books, organizing a chaos he had created. In the margins, in the privacy of her mind, she calculated how long he had before the banks took everything. It was too long. She did not intend to wait for the slow collapse men like Dalton, even ruined, kept their power over the bodies they owned. Death, swift and decisive, was the only true subtraction she could imagine. She could not set this fire herself. Too many eyes watched the main house, too many people slept under its roof, too many doors creaked in unfamiliar ways. But she had something new, an ally whose rage burned hotter than any lamp oil. Ruth lived in the kitchen's heat, hands scarred by scalds and knife slips. Sold away from her children years earlier, she moved through her work with a quiet ferocity that no one but Clara seemed to notice. In snatched moments over simmering pots or beside the back door where night air pushed away the steam, Ruth spoke, not in complete stories but in fragments, of little hands taken from hers, of an auctioneer's voice, of a man who laughed when she begged. Dalton had not bought her children, but he had bought her. For Ruth, the distinction hardly mattered. Clara never said, "Set the fire." She spoke instead of accidents that might happen, of how easily books and curtains burned, of how rich men trusted wood and paper and oil more than they trusted the people who moved quietly through their houses. She mentioned, almost lazily, that the locked doors in the upstairs hallway could be turned from the outside if one had the right key. Ruth listened with eyes that had gone very still. On the appointed night in February, snow lay in dirty heaps along the edges of the yard. Dalton drank himself into a stupor beside the parlor fire, while Clara, always Clara, sat nearby with her sewing. She watched the rise and fall of his chest, the slackening of his jaw. When his head finally drooped, she folded her work, wished him good night, and climbed the stairs. But she did not sleep in the room where he now came to her, as he had once gone only to his wife. Instead, she lay fully dressed on the bed, counting heartbeats, listening. Below, the house shifted, coals collapsing in their grates, wind pressing against shutters, the faint scrape of a door. When the alarm came, shouts, pounding steps, the sudden bowing roar of a fire grown bold. She was already in the hallway with the others, feigning confusion. Smoke curled up the staircase. Someone yelled that the library was burning, that the flames raced along the floor as if the boards themselves had turned to oil. Ruth stood in the doorway to the yard, light from the fire turning the tears on her cheeks to hard, bright beads. No one thought to ask why her hands shook, why she could not bring herself to look up at the second floor where Dalton's closed door rattled once, twice, as he woke too late and found the knob immovable. By dawn, the library was ash. Dalton lay blackened in his bed. Investigators found no sign of forced locks, no footprints that told a story other than their own desire to be done with this ugly business. They wrote accidental fire on their papers and rode away. Sarah had left 2 days before, they all agreed. She had set off for Richmond with a small bundle and the promise to visit a sick aunt. She was a good worker, Ruth told the men who asked. Shame she gone. With Dalton's money folded into her clothes and fresh papers naming her something else, Clara traveled south and east, a quiet passenger in wagons and riverboats, one more woman whose history no one bothered to learn. At the Pritchard plantation in Brunswick County, the game changed. The house was smaller than Riverside or Dalton's place, more tired, walls bearing the faint sag of years spent propping up a crumbling economy. Lawrence Pritchard had a wife when Clara arrived. Catherine, thin and pale, lungs rattling in her chest. The plantation doctor called it a weak constitution. Anyone who had watched people die for long enough recognized the slow drowning of consumption. Here Clara became Rachel. She tended to Catherine with a competence that startled the mistress at first. Most enslaved women learned to bind wounds and mix herbs because they had to, but Rachel knew how to measure laudanum carefully, how to read the Latin labels in the doctor's black bag. She changed sheets without complaint, wiped sweat from Catherine's forehead, listened when the woman whispered bitter memories of dances in Richmond ballrooms, and the fine dresses she had worn before marriage had locked her to this patch of exhausted Virginia soil. Sometimes I dream I never left the city, Catherine said one night, voice thin as paper. Then I wake and remember the smell of tobacco and mud. She coughed until red speckles bloomed in her handkerchief. You'll see. This place eats us all. A month later, she was gone. The house fell quieter without the hiss of Catherine's breathing from the upstairs room, but grief never truly settled over the place Lawrence mourned in the way men of his class often did. With a black band on his sleeve and an eye already turning toward the next set of problems, debts pressed harder. The fields yielded less. He had 3 children who needed shoes and tutors and futures. For those things he needed money, and he had very little left. Rachel, Clara, stepped into the empty space Catherine left. She supervised the house servants, balanced account books, soothed crying children, kept the kitchen from chaos. Lawrence grew used to seeing her skillful hands everywhere, in the cleanliness of his shirts, in the orderly rows of figures in his ledgers. In the neat way, his desk never quite fell back into the disorder he created. And at night, when the children slept and the house shrank down to creaks in size, he began to seek her out. He had inherited not only land but his father's hunger. He told himself he meant only to discuss the next planting, the upcoming visit from a creditor in town. His feet still turned toward the small room at the end of the second-floor hall where Rachel slept. Sometimes he found her reading by candlelight from a discarded newspaper, lips moving silently over the printed words. He would stand in the doorway for a moment, watching. "You read better than most white farmers," he joked once, trying to make his interest harmless. "Yes, sir," she said, eyes lowered, and he could not decide whether she had taken it as compliment or insult. When he touched her the first time, she did not flinch. That was the worst of it, he thought later, that she accepted him with such calm. It allowed him to pretend she had chosen this, allowed him to ignore the law and custom that made refusal impossible. He had already insured the tobacco barns by then. The policy documents lay in a neat stack on his desk, smelling faintly of ink and hope. He had spoken in a low, quick voice when he told her about them, as if confessing a sin. If one of the barns, if lightning struck, or some stray spark, it might be the salvation of this place, he muttered, unable to look at her. The insurance would cover the loss and more. Enough to square things in town. It must be a terrible thing, she said softly, to pray for fire. He stared at her, startled by the words, then laughed harshly. Terrible men don't pray, he said. They act. He did not notice the way her gaze slid past him to the window, measuring the distance from barn to house, the angle of the prevailing wind. On the night the barn burned, he believed himself in control. He had sent the children away. He had arranged witnesses. He had given Rachel money to buy supplies in Lawrenceville, ensuring she would not be present if anything went wrong. He struck the first spark himself, hands shaking, whispering something that was not quite a prayer, as the dry tobacco leaves caught and began to glow. Still, a part of him recoiled as he watched flames climb the rafters. Years of fearing fire as the great enemy of planters rose up in him, battling the desperate part that saw only dollar signs in the billowing smoke. He backed away, telling himself that the distance was enough. It would have been, if not for the windows. Earlier that day, Clara had worked her way through the house with a cloth in her hand, cleaning glass, humming softly. She had unlatched certain sashes, left one door's bolt half-slipped, loosened a catch on the back porch so that the wind could open it with a steady hand. When the barn roof caved in and sent a geyser of sparks into the sky, those sparks found easy purchase in the currents she had prepared. Within minutes, embers landed on the shingles over the kitchen. Dry wood took the gift greedily. Flames ran along the eaves, dropped to the porch, licked at the door that hung slightly ajar. Smoke wandered into the hallways. Men shouting about the barn turned and saw the house haloed suddenly in red. Lawrence ran toward it in panic. This was not the plan. The house was his inheritance, his father's pride, the visible proof of his family's place in the world. Insurance was for barns, for sheds, for outbuildings. Not for the home where portraits watched from the walls. The front door would not open. He threw his shoulder against it, cursed the lock, felt it resist like an enemy. He raced around to the back and found that door wedged, the frame swollen by sudden heat, the latch refusing his hand. Inside, the smoke thickened. His lungs clawed for air. He staggered away, turned back, tried again. When he fell close to the staircase, one hand stretched toward the second floor, where Rachel's room stood empty. By the time neighbors arrived, the house was an inferno. They dragged his body out when the walls finally collapsed, but it was only a shape by then, no longer a man who had believed himself daring and clever. Rachel was seen that evening in town, bargaining over flour and candles. People remembered later how surprised she had looked when someone mentioned seeing a glow on the horizon, as if the Pritchard place were on fire. She dropped the parcel in her hand, they said, murmured something about the children, and rushed away. No one ever saw her again. 3 houses burned, 3 masters died. Across Virginia's Tidewater and Piedmont counties, rumors began to coil in the spaces official reports left blank. A woman, people whispered in kitchens and fields, a light-skinned woman who read and wrote and moved from one estate to another like a wandering flame. She did not raise rebellions or preach in secret or gather men with guns. She used the master's own sins, insurance schemes, greed, loneliness, like dry tinder. In Caroline County, Magistrate Edward Hutchinson pinned the rumors to a map. He had the kind of mind that hated coincidence. Pattern comforted him. Disorder kept him awake at night. When the fourth and fifth fires came, one in Pittsylvania County, one in his own jurisdiction, he sat alone in his office with 5 thin files spread out across his desk. Outside, the courthouse yard was quiet, the big oak tree casting evening shadows across the steps. Inside, Hutchinson read and reread the witness statements until his eyes blurred. The details matched too neatly. A woman in the house, always in the house, sometimes called Clara, sometimes Sarah, Rachel, Hannah. The descriptions varied. One witness said her eyes were dark, another that they were a strange light brown. But the shape of her, the way she spoke, the fact of her literacy repeated like a refrain. The fires started in or near rooms where the master slept or kept his papers. Insurance policies had been taken out in the months before. In every case, the woman had vanished. He felt fear then, a cold, unfamiliar version that did not come from threats outside the walls of his world, but from within them. Slavery, as he understood it, depended on certainty. White authority must appear total, inevitable, as natural as gravity. Enslaved people might resist in small ways, broken tools, feigned illness, but murder on this scale, carried out with such intelligence, touched the very foundation. If one could do this, others could learn. The meeting at the governor's mansion took place under chandeliers that had seen more pleasant occasions. John Floyd paced in front of the long windows as Hutchinson laid out his evidence, voice low but steady. Around the polished table, planters and sheriffs and judges listened, their faces hardening. Most of the men had lost acquaintances in the fires. Some had lost kin. Yet what horrified them most was not the deaths alone, but the thought of the story escaping the room. If word spreads that an enslaved woman has killed 5 masters and walked away, one planter said hoarsely, how long before every Negro kitchen from here to Georgia is whispering her name? They already whisper, another answered. What we control is what they whisper about. So they chose erasure. Records were altered, burned, rewritten. Official reports called the fires accidents, or at worst the tragic result of a master's foolishness with insurance. Newspapers printed brief notices and moved on. No broadsides went up with the woman's description. No rewards were offered publicly. Instead, quiet letters went out along private channels warning planners to watch any new educated house servant with unusual care. That decision saved the institution's image for a time, but it saved no one's life. In Southampton County, where Nat Turner's uprising still haunted white memory, Walter Kensington hired a woman called Hannah. She came with papers, naming her a free domestic from Petersburg. She knew how to starch a shirt properly, how to manage a nursery, how to prepare coffee the way his dead wife had liked it. She carried herself with a composed dignity that struck Walter as near to white ladies he had known in Richmond. Lonely, buried in debts, and haunted by a baby's deathbed, he felt gratitude bloom into something else before he even realized Jonathan, his younger brother, saw more clearly. He watched Hannah during his visits from Richmond, the way she slipped through the house without ever seeming startled or hurried, the ease with which she read notes over Walter's shoulder when he invited her opinion, the careful vagueness of her stories about kin in other counties. Jonathan had heard whispers in the city, fragmented gossip about a woman in fires, about a private crisis among the planter class that no one would explain openly. When he asked questions, men changed the subject. That only sharpened his suspicion. "Brother," he said one night in the study, while Hannah's shadow passed briefly along the hallway outside, "you don't know who she is." "I know exactly who she is," Walter answered, voice tight. "She is the person keeping this house from falling apart. She is the only one in this place who listens." Jonathan thought of the men whose houses had burned, of the files Hutchinson had reluctantly shown him. He thought of his brother's thin financial situation, the insurance policies he had found in Walter's desk. Fear scraped at his nerves. "Send her away," he urged. "At least until what?" Walter slammed his glass down. "Until your phantom arsonist appears? You've been scaring yourself with stories, Jonathan. I will not throw a loyal servant into the road because of rumors." When Jonathan went to the sheriff instead, he crossed an invisible line from brother to enemy in Walter's eyes, but he went anyway. By then, the machinery set in motion in the governor's mansion had reached Southampton. The sheriff had Clara's descriptions in a locked drawer, the paper creased from folding and unfolding. He listened to Jonathan's account without interruption, thumb tapping on the desk. When the younger Kensington finished, the sheriff nodded once. "I can't act on gossip," he said, "but I can watch." It was enough to change the ending. Hannah, Clara, felt the air shift around her in the days that followed. Questions came from unexpected mouths. The sheriff appeared too often on the lane, tips his hat, but studying her with a soldier's stare. In the market, two men fell abruptly silent when she came close, as if they had been speaking her name. She had lived too long on the edge of danger to ignore what her bones told her. So on a damp April night, one without stars, she rose from her pallet before the rooster crowed and dressed in the dark. No fire had yet taken root in Kensington's house. No oil slicked the hallways. No barn roof glowed in the distance. She left before the story could repeat, slipping into the woods with nothing but the clothes on her back, money sewn into her hem, and a new name already forming in her mind. When the sheriff arrived the next morning with warrants and iron shackles, he found an empty room and a cold hearth. The hunt that followed spread beyond Virginia's borders. Patrols combed roads. Slave catchers sniffed out rumors of light-skinned women traveling alone in Philadelphia, where free black communities threaded their lives between cautious hope and constant fear. A seamstress called Mary Hendricks kept to herself, head bowed over the seams of dresses she would never wear. A fugitive hunter recognized her in a crowd. The arrest was quick, brutal, and public, meant to send a message. Chains bit into her wrists as marshals dragged her south. In the jolting darkness of the wagon, she stared at her manacled hands, the same hands that had poured wine, copied ledgers, struck flint, and loosened latches. When questions came, "Who taught you to read? Who helped you? How many more like you are there?" she answered with silence. In Richmond, the jail stank of mildew and old fear. She listened to the city's sounds, different from the rural hush of plantations, carriage wheels over cobblestones, vendors shouting, distant church bells. The trial took place only a few blocks away in a courtroom that tried very hard not to be a stage. Officials wanted speed, certainty, quiet. Witnesses from 5 counties testified, their words circling the same shape. A woman in their house, a fire, a disappearance. Papers and trinkets taken from her belongings linked her to places she had once walked. A scrap of Dalton's letterhead, a key from Riverside, a child's bracelet stolen from Pritchard's parlor. Jonathan Kensington stood and told the court how he had watched her, how his warnings had gone unheeded. Through it all, she sat very straight, eyes lowered, jaw relaxed. When the sentence came, death by hanging, no one was surprised. The law knew few other answers when skin like hers was accused of killing skin like theirs. The date was set. The records were marked for restricted storage, though most of those records would later meet the fire they feared. In the cramped cell 3 days before her execution, she finally chose to speak. Hutchinson had come not as magistrate, but as a man who could not live with questions. He stood outside the bars, hat in his hands, feeling oddly younger than his 60 years. "I want to understand," he said simply. "Why them?" She studied him for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but clear, with the careful diction of someone who had built language herself from stolen pieces. "They were not special," she said. "That is the point." He blinked. "You killed 5 men." She lifted her shackled hands, the chain between them rattling softly. "5 owners," she corrected. 5 men who owned people the way they owned fields and furniture. 5 out of thousands. You call them victims because the law writes their names. I call them examples." He asked about accomplices, about teachers, about origin. She gave him fragments, nothing that would endanger those who had forged papers for her or whispered letters into her ear. When he asked if she regretted what she had done, she smiled for the first and only time he would see. "I regret that I failed to finish," she said. "I wanted them to know that their houses could burn from the inside. I wanted them to imagine every candle, every lamp in a servant's hand as a question." He left the jail with her words lodged under his ribs like a splinter. On the day of the hanging, clouds gathered low over the city. The crowd that came to watch wore their Sunday best, faces set in the complicated expressions people bring to spectacles they tell themselves they do not enjoy. Planters stood with arms folded while enslaved people clustered at the back under the watchful eyes of patrolmen. For them, every public punishment was part warning, part whispered sermon. She walked to the gallows without stumbling. The rope looked rough and oddly small against the broad sky. When the minister murmured about forgiveness, she did not reply. When the executioner asked if she had any last words, she stayed silent, lips pressed together, eyes on some point beyond the wooden frame. The trapdoor dropped. The rope snapped tight. A few in the crowd flinched. Most watched with hard curiosity. By evening, an unmarked grave held her body in earth chosen precisely because no one would think to visit. Virginia's officials congratulated themselves. The threat had been removed. The record, such as it was, lay under their control. They urged one another to speak of the matter as little as possible for the good of public order. But stories are harder to bury than bones. In the quarters along the James River, in cabins near Charlottesville, in cramped rooms behind shops in Richmond and Philadelphia, versions of her story moved from mouth to mouth. Sometimes she was called Clara, sometimes Mary, sometimes no name at all, only the woman who burned them. In one song, she walked out of the fire unscathed, dress unburned, eyes bright. In another, she turned into smoke and slipped through keyholes to haunt every master's dreams. Children growing up under the lash heard those tales and felt something widen in their chests. Not hope exactly. Hope was dangerous, but a different understanding. The knowledge that the order of things was not as fixed as they had been told. Years later, when war came and plantations cracked under the weight of their own contradictions, men with guns and uniforms would claim the credit. They would write history in official language, heavy with dates and battles. Somewhere between those lines lived a quieter memory of a woman who had used no army but herself. Hutchinson wrote his journals until his hand began to tremble too much to hold the pen. He described the fires, the trial, the conversation in the cell. He described his unease, the sense that if he condemned her entirely, he must also condemn the world that had made her possible. He hid the journals where orders could not reach them, trusting blindly that someone, someday, would need to read what had truly happened. When he died in 1871, a generation already busy rewriting the story of the South, no one noticed that a box in his attic remained stubbornly untouched. Almost a century later, a researcher pried it open. Dust lifted in the air like old ghosts. Inside lay the journals, edges browned, ink faded but legible. In those cramped lines, the woman emerged again from the shadow where officials had tried to keep her. Not a rumor, not only a song, but a person whose choices could be traced and argued with historians would debate whether every detail was accurate, whether Hutchinson embroidered or misremembered. Yet the pattern he had seen, the fires, the missing woman, the fear, shone through undeniably. Even with the journals, the questions outnumbered the answers. No one could say where she had been born, who first put a book into her hands, how many times she had almost been caught before she finally was. Her grave remained unmarked, her face unconfirmed. But the record of what she had done to those 5 houses, and why, stood stubbornly in ink that refused to fade completely. The plantations she burned never quite recovered. The land was carved up, sold off, abandoned. New owners plowed over old foundations. Children played where masters had once taken their ease. In some places, trees grew thick around crumbled bricks, roots prying apart what human hands had built. On quiet evenings when the sun slid low over Virginia fields, the ruins looked almost peaceful, as if the earth itself had decided to reclaim what had been used against it. Somewhere under that same earth lay the body of the woman who had helped fire do its work. Her story does not offer comfort. It does not ask for simple approval. It sits instead at the uneasy point where justice, revenge, and survival intersect, demanding that anyone who hears it decide which life in it they feel most bound to. The owners who believed their power eternal, or the woman who taught them, one burning house at a time, that nothing built on other people's broken bodies can truly be safe.